In March 2020, a hedge fund manager with 2 decades of experience sold his entire portfolio at a 40% loss. 6 months later, those same holdings would have been worth 80% more than his original investment. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't inexperienced. But something in his brain had fundamentally changed the moment he started losing money. And the same thing happens to you. Here's what nobody tells you about losing money. You don't just lose dollars. You lose yourself. Your rational mind, the one that carefully researched investments and calculated risk-reward ratios, gets shoved aside. And something else takes over. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, called this the shadow. It's the part of your psyche that contains everything you don't want to admit about yourself. Your fears, your impulses, your desperate, irrational survival instincts. When you're making money, you're calm, strategic, patient. You say things like, "I'm investing for the long term, and I don't check my portfolio every day." But the moment those numbers turn red, a different person shows up. Research in behavioral finance has consistently shown that losses feel approximately twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. This isn't just a saying. It's called loss aversion, and it was documented by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their groundbreaking work on prospect theory. Here's what makes financial loss particularly devastating. It's not just about the money. When you lose money, especially significant amounts, you're confronting a terrifying possibility. That you were wrong. That you're not as smart as you thought. That you can't protect yourself or your family. These aren't rational calculations. They're existential threats. And your brain responds accordingly. Imagine someone who bought their first investment property in 2007. They'd done the research. The market always goes up, everyone said. They stretched their budget. Took on debt they could barely afford. Then 2008 happened. Suddenly, they're not just losing money, they're losing their identity as a competent adult. Their self-image as someone who makes smart decisions. Their sense of control over their future. The shadow emerges, and it doesn't think. It reacts. It panics. It makes the pain stop by any means necessary, even if those means guarantee larger losses later. This is the moment when people sell low. When they double down on losing bets. When they avoid opening their account statements for months, not because they're foolish, but because a different part of their psyche has taken control. Understanding this isn't just interesting psychology. It's the difference between financial survival and ruin. Let me tell you about Enron's employees. Not the executives who went to prison, but the regular workers who lost everything. In 2001, Enron was America's 7th largest company. Its employees weren't just invested in the company through their 401k retirement accounts. On average, Enron workers had 62% of their retirement savings in Enron stock. Some had over 90%. Financial advisors call this concentration risk, but to these employees it felt like loyalty, like confidence, like smart investing. After all, Enron stock had climbed from $20 to over $90 per share in just a few years. Then, cracks started appearing. In August 2001, CEO Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned. The stock began falling. $80, then $70, then $60. Here's where the psychology gets fascinating. As the stock fell, many Enron employees didn't sell. They bought more. They were averaging down, they told themselves, getting a better price, being contrarian when others panicked. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Selling would mean admitting they'd been wrong, that the company they'd dedicated years to was failing, that their judgment was flawed. The pain of that admission felt worse than watching their retirement accounts shrink. By October, the stock was at $15. Enron admitted to accounting irregularities. Still, many employees held on. Some even borrowed money to buy more shares. Why? Because they'd crossed a psychological threshold. The loss had become so large that it stopped feeling real. Psychologists call this the ostrich effect. When facing severe financial loss, people literally avoid information. They stop checking their portfolios. They don't open statements. They know something terrible is happening, but gathering specific information makes it undeniably real. One Enron employee later told reporters he had over $600,000 in Enron stock in February 2001. By December, when Enron declared bankruptcy, it was worth $4,000. He'd had dozens of opportunities to sell and preserve at least some value, but each day, the shadow convinced him that admitting the loss would hurt more than holding on, that tomorrow might bring recovery, that selling would make the loss permanent, but holding kept hope alive. This is the logic of trauma, not investment strategy. And it's not unique to Enron. It happens to retail traders holding failing stocks, to property investors watching real estate values collapse, to anyone who ties their identity to their financial decisions. The money becomes secondary to protecting the ego from a devastating truth: that you were wrong, and that you should have known better. Scientists have actually watched this happen inside people's brains. In a landmark study, researchers at Stanford University used fMRI scanners to observe brain activity while people made financial decisions involving potential losses. What they found was remarkable. When participants faced potential financial losses, regions of their brain associated with physical pain lit up. Not metaphorical pain, actual pain. The same areas activated when you touch a hot stove or stub your toe. Your brain literally processes financial loss as physical injury. But it gets more specific. The insula, a region deep in the brain associated with disgust and visceral negative emotions, showed heightened activity during loss scenarios. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, where rational decision-making happens, showed decreased activity. In other words, losing money doesn't just feel bad, it temporarily impairs your ability to think clearly. Another study by researchers at Carnegie Mellon University found that when people are already experiencing losses, they make increasingly risky decisions. Not more careful ones, more reckless ones. They documented what they called the house money effect in reverse. When you're winning, you become more willing to take risks with your gains because it feels like free money. But when you're losing, you take desperate risks to break even, to erase the pain, to return to zero. This explains so much irrational behavior. The day trader who loses $5,000 in the morning and then risks $20,000 on a speculative bet in the afternoon. The gambler who's down $500 and makes a $1,000 bet to get it all back. The investor who sells solid holdings to double down on the position that's losing. Daniel Kahneman writes about this extensively in his book Thinking, Fast and Slow. He describes how losses loom larger than gains, not just emotionally but cognitively. We literally think about them differently. When you gain $1,000, your brain evaluates it rationally. It's pleasant, but abstract. When you lose $1,000, your brain treats it as an emergency, a threat, something that demands immediate action. This is why financial advisors tell you to have a plan before you invest. Because once you're losing, your ability to make a rational plan has been compromised. Your shadow is in control, and it's not interested in optimal long-term strategy. It wants the pain to stop, now. The research also shows that this effect intensifies with larger losses, and when losses are framed as missing out on previous gains. If you bought stock at $100, watched it rise to $150, and then fall to $120, you don't feel like you're up $20. You feel like you lost $30. Your brain anchors to the peak, and everything below that feels like loss. This is called the peak end rule, and it explains why market volatility is so psychologically damaging, even when the overall trend is positive. Understanding the neuroscience doesn't make you immune, but it does give you a framework. When you feel that visceral disgust, that desperate urge to act, you can recognize it. That's not strategy. That's your insula. That's the shadow. And it's a terrible investor. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people have learned to profit from your shadow. They know exactly how you'll behave when you're losing money, and they've built entire strategies around it. Consider the world of activist short sellers. These are investors who bet against companies, then publicly release damaging research to drive the stock price down. One of the most famous is Carson Block of Muddy Waters Research. His firm identifies companies they believe are fraudulent or overvalued, takes a short position, then publishes detailed reports exposing problems. When the stock crashes, they profit. But here's the psychology play. Once that report comes out and the stock starts falling, retail investors, the regular people who own shares, face a choice. Sell now at a loss, or hold and hope the report is wrong. Their shadow kicks in. Many hold. They can't bear to realize the loss. They convince themselves the short seller is lying, manipulating, trying to steal their money. Sometimes they're right, but often they're just avoiding pain. And while they hold, hoping for vindication, the stock continues falling. The short sellers know this. They're counting on it. They understand that investors experiencing loss become predictably irrational. They hold too long. They average down. They attack the messenger instead of evaluating the message. This same psychology plays out in crypto markets with particular intensity. In early 2022, the cryptocurrency Luna collapsed from $116 to essentially zero in just 48 hours. As it fell, online forums filled with investors encouraging each other to buy the dip, to hold the line, to not give the short sellers what they want. Some people bought more Luna at $80, then at $40, then at $10. Each purchase was their shadow, trying to prove they hadn't made a mistake, trying to average down their cost basis, trying to turn a catastrophic loss into just a bad trade. The final collapse wiped out an estimated $40 billion in value. Market makers and professional traders understand this pattern intimately. They know that retail investors become the most predictable when they're panicking. That fear creates patterns. Panic selling at market bottoms. Desperate buying of risky assets to recoup losses. Emotional, telegraphed moves that professionals can position against. In his book Influence, Robert Cialdini explains how our automatic responses, our psychological shortcuts, can be triggered and exploited. The shadow is one of those automatic responses. It's a survival mechanism that served us well when threats were physical and immediate. But in financial markets, it's a liability. And some people have learned to read it like a map. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's just understanding incentives. When your shadow takes over, you become predictable. And in markets, predictable is profitable. For someone else. The solution isn't to stop having emotions. That's impossible. The solution is to recognize when your shadow has taken control and have systems in place that prevent it from making irreversible decisions. Stop-loss orders. Pre-committed sell points. Rules you made when you were rational that your panicking self can't override. Because once the loss becomes real, once that pain centers fire up in your brain, you're not thinking clearly. You're surviving. And survival mode rarely aligns with optimal financial strategy. So how do you actually deal with this? How do you make good decisions when your brain is screaming that you're in danger? First, understand that you can't eliminate the shadow. Jung was clear about this. The goal isn't to destroy the dark parts of your psyche. It's to integrate them, to recognize them, to make them conscious. Here's a practical framework. Before you make any investment, write down 3 things. 1. At what price or percentage loss will I sell, no matter what I think or feel at that moment? 2. What would have to fundamentally change about this investment for my thesis to be wrong? 3. What will I tell myself when I'm losing money to justify not following my own rules? That third question is crucial. Your shadow has favorite stories. I'm being contrarian. This is just temporary volatility. Smart money is buying right now. Write those stories down before you're in the middle of a loss, because when you're losing money and you hear yourself telling those stories, you'll recognize it. That's the shadow. That's the part of you that's in pain and will say anything to make it stop. Morgan Housel writes in The Psychology of Money that the ability to stick with a strategy that's temporarily losing money is one of the most valuable financial skills. But you can't develop that skill in the moment. You have to prepare for it. Some of the best investors use what they call pre-mortems. Before making an investment, they imagine it's failed. They write down what probably went wrong, what signs they ignored, what their emotional state was when they held too long. This isn't pessimism. It's rehearsal. You're teaching yourself to recognize the patterns before they happen. So when that hedge fund manager in March 2020 felt overwhelming fear, he would have recognized it. That's not analysis. That's my amygdala at it. That's the shadow telling me to run. And he could have chosen differently. Not by suppressing the fear, but by acknowledging it and following his pre-committed rules anyway. Another technique. The 72-hour rule. When you feel an overwhelming urge to make a major financial decision during a loss, wait 72 hours. Not to change your mind, but to let the initial panic subside. To let your prefrontal cortex come back online. If selling is still the right decision after 3 days, it probably is. But if you're making it in the first hour of a market crash, you're probably making it with your insula, not your cortex. Here's the paradox. The investors who do best during downturns aren't the ones who feel no fear. They're the ones who feel the fear, recognize it, and have systems that prevent fear from making decisions. They've made friends with their shadow. They know its voice, and when it starts talking, they don't argue with it. They just don't let it control the portfolio. Remember that hedge fund manager from the beginning, with Perience? The one who sold everything at a 40% loss? He didn't lack intelligence or experience. He lacked self-awareness in that moment. He didn't recognize that the person making the decision wasn't the rational professional. It was the terrified human whose sense of competence was being threatened. Your worst financial decisions won't come from lack of information. They'll come from the part of you that can't tolerate the pain of being wrong. That part isn't your enemy. It's just doing its job. Your job is to recognize when it's talking, thank it for its concern, and make decisions based on the strategy you created when you were thinking clearly. Because you will lose money. Markets crash. Investments fail. Unexpected things happen. The question isn't whether you'll face losses. It's who'll be in control when you do. Your strategy or your shadow. If this helped you understand your own financial behavior a little better, consider subscribing. We explore the psychology behind money decisions every week. Next, we're looking at why people stay in failing businesses long after they should quit. The sunk cost fallacy in action. You won't want to miss it.